All right. Well, good morning, everyone, to our staff in Olympia and wherever they may be, our board, and those joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to our left to October 27th, 2021 board meeting. And as we normally do, let's take a moment of silence to remember our fallen brothers and sisters. All right, thank you very much. Looking at our agenda, we've got 5 things outlined, and I know historically this has kind of been a meeting that we get some education, some updates, lay out some of our future plans, and so I'll turn it over to Mr. Nelson. Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you're right. The format of this meeting today is kind of looking at some of the strategic, if you will, challenges that are facing the board in the near future. Some of these are spin-offs of issues that you've been talking about already this interim. And some of these are issues then, the first presentation that I'll be sharing with you guys is a little bit new for many of you. So let me just jump into that one. So what this presentation is board governance challenges. And it's what has happened in the past is different areas of responsibility for the board come into play with parties other than the board. The most common situation where this comes up is something along the lines of somebody in the legislature proposes a bill, and in that bill they are acting in one of the areas of the board's responsibilities, setting rates, changing actuarial assumptions, something along those lines. And that raises issues. And then frequently, especially if it's during session, I get called in to those discussions. And by way of background, something along those lines happened last session. So there was a legislator who was interested in proposing a bill, and as part of that bill, it would have affected contribution rates for Left 2 to provide the state some savings. One of the challenges that raises when the legislature potentially, and that bill never ended up getting introduced or anything, but during the course of talking about the issues that were raised with that legislator and with legislative staff, this whole question about governance came up. And so I was explaining the historical position of the board and of staff with respect to governance. And I realized, you know what, the board has changed. I keep realizing this, I learned the same lesson over and over and over again. It seems like every year, but the board has changed a lot since we've talked about governance in the past. And so I didn't feel as confident this past session when I was sharing how the board felt, if you will, about governance. I just had to say, you know what, the board hasn't really talked about this in a while, but historically this was their position. And neither, I don't think any of the people that I was talking with were overly confident then that they knew how the bill would be received by the board and by stakeholder groups with representatives on the board. So today I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the different areas of responsibility, how they come up, and historically how I have presented the board's position on those issues, and then find out from you, this will hopefully be a bit of a discussion, whether or not you have questions about that, if that still represents sort of the feelings of the board, or if things have evolved, or if you have more would like more information, and we can talk about these issues or particular details with respect to these issues in further board meetings. So the primary, and this is not everything, but this is some of the primary areas of responsibility for the board that sometimes end up coming into play with parties outside the board. There'll be a bill, for instance, is usually how the earlier ones come up, where as part of the bill, the state would like to save some money, and so they would like to adopt rates lower than what the board has already adopted. The statutes clearly provide that the board sets contribution rates, but after the board was created, there was also a statute that said the board sets contribution rates, but they can be revised by the legislature. So you actually, right now in statute, we have two rate setting statutes. One says it's the board's responsibility. One says it's the board's responsibility, but it can be amended by the legislature. And that's created an interesting legal question that has been discussed almost since the board's very beginning. Other states, like New York, for example, they have held that having an independent board of trustees set the contribution rates and the funding policies for the plan is a benefit of the plan. And it's protected just as much as any other benefit, like the 2% multiplier, for instance. So in other words, in Washington terms, that would mean Bachenhaus would apply to the board's authority to set rates. Now, that's a New York case. There hasn't been a Washington case. And over the years, that's resulted in a very interesting balance. And in some ways, that has worked out really well. I had a conversation several years ago with the Speaker of the House, and he said he liked this balance. He said, you know, this uncertainty about who really sets rates. How would a court answer that question if it showed up in court? Is a good thing. It encourages the board to adopt reasonable rates, and it encourages the legislature to go ahead and fund those rates once they're adopted by the board. Because if the legislature changed the rates and the stakeholder groups sued, one way or another, then that uncertainty, that tension would be eliminated. Either it would be clear that the board would have sole rate setting authority and the legislature might lose some of their influence that way, or the other way around. It would be clear that the legislature could set the rates wherever they wanted, and the board's authority would be, in that sense, a little bit more advisory than it is now. That setting of contribution rates issue has probably been the one that has come up the most. There hasn't been a whole lot of interest in changing anything about left to, other than occasionally it comes up with respect to budget. So that's where the desire to get a little extra money for the state budget by lowering the contribution rates for, typically it's part of lowering the rates for all the plans, including left to. Sometimes in addition to lowering the rates, or as a kind of a justification for lowering the rates, the legislation will include some new funding policy, like the legislature believes that an 80% floor is more appropriate than a 90% floor, or that the aggregate funding method should be used for left to. And so they'll actually apply some of these actuarial assumptions or these funding policies in the legislation as a basis for changing the contribution rates. So those first three issues, the setting the contribution rates, setting funding policies, setting the actuarial assumptions, those all tend to come up together. And historically, again, that's been the answer. The answer has been the board sets the rates. If you change the rates, that will be challenged in court by the stakeholder groups. And in other states, it's been held to be a constitutionally protected benefit. We don't know how a Washington court would answer. And that's how I have characterized that issue when it has come up. Less common, but still occasionally coming up, is you will have a legislator who will recommend a benefit change outside of the board process. And recommending changes to Left Plan 2 is one of the responsibilities of the board. I wouldn't characterize it, though, in the same category as the first three: setting rates, setting funding policies, setting actuarial assumptions. Those are all specifically, those are the types of powers that could be Bakken-House protected. And recommending benefit changes, that's more general. That's one of your important responsibilities. The board has recommended over 30 different pieces of legislation that have passed since the board came into existence. Usually what happens when those things, when something like that comes up, is a quick check to find out, is there a price tag? Have they done the kind of same kind of background work, for instance, that the board has typically done? And the answer is commonly no. And so then it'll be, how would you feel about holding off on your bill? And we'll add that to the, I'll do it as part of my legislative update, and then we'll see if the board would be willing to study that issue in the upcoming interim. And then they can get some of the policy questions answered, some of the price questions answered that occasionally come up. And so that has historically been my responsibility, or my response, I should say, when those types of governance challenges come up during session. And then the last two get a little bit more, they're a little bit different. These typically don't come up as a part of legislation or from legislators or legislative staff. They typically come up from the board's interactions with other state agencies, whether it's OFM with respect to the budget, or state HR with respect to personnel, or DES HR. And the board, TOR has worked with the board in the past about the guidelines for your adopting the agency budget and where you can set the budget. And we haven't ever hit the point. There were a couple times where we weren't sure that the board would be able to accomplish all of the things that you wanted to accomplish as trustees within the budget threshold set by OFM. But you always have. So we've never hit that question, we've never crossed that line where you felt as trustees you needed to spend more money than OFM was authorizing us to spend. And then the final one that I wanted to talk about, and this one definitely came up last session, and it's been a couple of ways since then, has to do with personnel. The board has the responsibility to hire the staff necessary to carry out your duties. A while back, there was a question about me personally, what kind of salary, for instance, you could pay me. And that question ended up being resolved by legislation. Here more recently, we've had similar questions come up with a couple of people on the team. And we've also had questions come up with other state HR policies and how they affect your responsibility to hire personnel. There's been a couple of, I wouldn't say heavy, but in the past, there has been a couple of bills or threats of bills. For instance, there was a bill many years ago to repeal the Left Plant 2 board. That probably would have implicated Bacchenhouse rights, but there hasn't really, when the board was first created, I know many of you know, you were told by elected officials at that time that the board was created by an initiative, that as soon as the 2-year initiative period was over, there was going to be a push to repeal the board. That never materialized. I know when I first took this job, I was told, Steve, don't take this job because 2 years from now, there's not going to be a board and you're not going to have a job. And that kind of challenge has never really materialized. It's shown up, there hasn't been a push, for instance, to say we're cutting your staff, or you have to get rid of staff. I was curious as to whether or not some of that might materialize as part of the recent executive order and all of the surrounding directions regarding the vaccine mandate. But the board, we followed all the guidelines, all the steps according to that. So that, nothing along those lines I don't expect to pop up. But one of the areas where occasionally I'll get asked to write a bill or an amendment to a bill, like last session. And as part of that bill, they'll want to change the rates. And I'll say, you don't need to change the policies. You don't need to change the assumptions. If you want to get in and change the rates, just do that. And then maybe that bill will have a benefit change as part of it. Maybe it won't. But then I say, hey, if you're going to get into the board's governance this way, then the only way to protect yourself, or to protect against that challenge, then is to give on some of these other governance issues. So for instance, there might be a proposal to, as an example, many years ago, there was a merger proposal that I was asked to write. And it's like, okay, for 4 years, the state gets a holiday on setting rates. But once those 4 years are over, then it's 100% clear that it's a Bacchenhouse right that the board sets rates from that point forward, and all the funding policies and all the actuarial assumptions and the right for the board to set the salaries of all the agency personnel, that gets called out in the bill itself. And that part usually then that's where things get complicated. For instance, that's where I got the questions last year. The legislator is like, well, I want to save money, but honestly, I don't know how I feel about some of these other things, and I don't know how some of my colleagues are going to feel about some of these other things. And so that piece is how I've responded when I've been asked to write a bill. We got a little bit, the board got a little bit of legal guidance many years ago on some of these issues. There was a legislative requirement that the board and the pension or the Select Committee on Pension Policy do a study on merger, including state and federal legal issues. And these were questions that I brought up in the discussions with state counsel, the attorney that was hired to provide that, and they're in that report. So for instance, the question about, I asked the question, is it possible that this would be a Bakken House protected right in Washington like it is in New York? And it's like, of course, that's certainly possible. If the bill provided that the state gets a 4-year holiday, but then after that, the authority goes to the board clearly, do you think that under Bakken House, you can take something away as long as you're given something in addition to it? Is that close enough? Do you think that that could work then in a Bakken House legal challenge? And they're like, yeah, that seems like the kind of framework that could work. So you don't have to decide any of these, but I wanted to make it clear to you that these are the governance issues, how they come up, and how I've been responding to them. And then if there are questions, either offline or at now, we can fire away with any questions that you have about my responses or comments or anything related to any of these 6 areas of responsibility.
All right, thank you, Steve. Are there questions for Steve on this issue? And I can't see everybody, so if you would just go ahead and
Call out.
Yeah, call out by all means. I've got the screen shared. So, Steve, I'll start with a question on training. I know a couple of years ago we had talked about with the changeover in the board, trying to increase that training area, specifically related to some lines for registration, travel, and lodging, things of that nature. We were successful because I think you and your team were able to demonstrate our board, what our needs are and our responsibilities. Has any of that changed?
No. So that's an example, Dennis, of what I was talking about, where you have a fiduciary responsibility to be educated. And we had budget guidelines from OFM, and there was a question there for a while. We were really getting close to the line on whether or not all 11 of the board members could get the training that they felt was necessary without overspending the budget. And as it turned out, we were able to do that without making any changes. So we never exceeded the budget. And then since, for the last 18 months now, there's been training requirement opportunities have been diminished, and there's been some budget savings in other areas. So we haven't come close to hitting that again. But that's now it's on the radar for the future. And if something like that came up again, we'd be working with TOR. The board would be working with TOR to make clear where the lines were.
Thank you. Questions for Steve?
Hi, Mr. Chair. This is Mark Johnston.
Hey, Mark, go ahead, buddy.
So I don't have necessarily a question, but I do have a comment that might be helpful for maybe the newer members of the board. I've been on the board since its inception, and I think the things that Steve just described and the relationship between the board and the legislature has been has been very productive. It includes some certain specific responsibilities that the board has without stepping on the legislature's prerogatives to do what they're chartered to do under the statutes and under the law and under so I think that I don't see any need to change the relationship that we have with the legislature. And I think Steve has been doing a fantastic job managing that and some of those complex issues that I think have accrued to the benefit of the plan participants and to stakeholders throughout the state, the employers, the legislature. I think it's all been working very well. And my comment would be that I don't see any need to revamp that or change that in any substantial way.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. Are there other questions?
Yeah, Mark, not directly in response to that, but the one area that really kind of drove home for me last session was the personnel one. We're a state agency. We're subject to all of the same rights and responsibilities and limits as other state employees. We've got salary ranges that are set for the different positions. And occasionally then we've run into things where, and we've been able to navigate through most of them, but for instance, Washington doesn't pay for pension expertise the way other states or other plans around the country do. And so occasionally some of the pension professionals in the state of Washington, not just on the board, but in other Department of Retirement Systems and the legislature, they get stolen. Here recently, we had 6 Washington employees down managing California plans. So that's one area. And there are exceptions that you can request for salary above the band, for instance, but to this point, I haven't had any of those ever approved. And so that's one area where I have some concern. And I do know specifically when I brought up the agency personnel issue last session, that was one where there were a lot of questions and some pushback on. And then Wolf, I see you've got a question.
Thank you, Steve. I just wanted to underscore what Mark said. Having prior to my service on the board and work with local government, I was, shall we say, in the position of initiating some of the questions that are especially in the first 4 bullets. And I would right away say that Steve's approach, his care, his clarity, his sophistication about engaging with all, whether it's OFM or the legislature, is unmatched anywhere and has been extraordinary, and I wouldn't want that to change. I'd also say that the first 4 are intrinsically linked with one another. It's hard to do one or another without touching the others in some way. And Steve's always been pretty good about making sure people understood that you don't poke just at a funding policy or just at a contribution rate or an actuarial assumption without affecting everything else. That all being said, I don't think the questions are going to stop, in part because we have a rather deep and sophisticated, it's a complex pension environment in the state of Washington, but a deep and sophisticated way of engaging with it. State Actuary's Office, an SIB, a DRS, legislative staff who are quite knowledgeable, Attorney General staff who are quite knowledgeable about things, our left board staff who are quite knowledgeable and long-serving and involved in all of these matters. So I wouldn't expect any of the questions to go away. And the best thing I could recommend is keep answering the same way, and we do well going forward.
Thanks, Wolf. Steve, you see any other hands up? Not.
I'm not seeing anything, but I can't see everybody either. So
Yeah.
call out if you've got another question.
Let's see if I can see.
I'm just sure. I'm just gonna say that I feel compelled to just say that I concur with Steve's analysis and his presentation of the legal issues. He has as much or more experience than I do in these, so that's easy to do with his experience. But nonetheless, want to give the AG's imprimatur, if you will, on that. And then I guess I would raise two other things that I'd just like to bring to the attention of new board members, and that is that historically the board has not met in person or has had only very short meetings during session. And I just think that that's worth noting, because that's also the time when most things are happening or have the potential to happen. Unexpected issues may come up. And, we always have the ability to call emergency meetings or to change that practice. And I guess I would just make that statement that, it's keep your ear to the ground and be prepared, right? Then the second thing that I guess I would echo regarding Steve's comments is the personnel/budget issues. I'd say two things about that. One is I think that there's inflation that there may be, just because we've been under budget in the COVID years doesn't mean we're going to face we're not going to face pressure coming out of it. And the world, because also a lot of costs have been rising, and in particular, personnel related costs. And I'm just going to give one concrete example to illustrate Steve's point. And that is that I just lost, and Steve may not even know this yet, my colleague in the AG's office, Michael Nelson, who supported the Select Committee on Pensions, and me at the SIB, and he got a 60% pay hike, and that prompted me to look at what other agencies on the West Coast are paying for this type of pension expertise in lawyer world, and Steve is one of several lawyers, and the salary bands are dramatically higher than what we are paying in Washington. And I just lost someone as a result. So anyway, just wanted to make those comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Tor.
All right, Steve, I'm not seeing any hands up, nothing in the chat bar that I'm seeing right now. So, all right.
Then I will move on to the next item on the agenda. This is a presentation from Jacob. He has talked in the past about, as we've discussed, issues of using the benefit improvement account as part of paying for a benefit improvement, some of the unexpected challenges that have come up with that a little bit. And so now we want to talk with you a little bit about that in more detail, specific to that issue than we have. With that, I will turn it over to Jacob.
Morning. For the record, Jacob White, staff to the board. I am fighting a bit of a cold, not COVID, don't worry, but I will try not to cough into my mic during this presentation today. Quickly, there we go. So parts of this presentation will be familiar to the board as it's pulled from some of the previous presentations I've done this year on benefit improvement and the benefit improvement account. As Steve said, or kind of alluded to, the intent of this presentation is to help set the stage for the next presentation that Steve will be doing to the board, which I think the hope of that is it'll be a bit more of a discussion among board members of some of the issues raised here and some additional issues. So the main two issues I'm going to discuss today are the mechanics and impact of using the benefit improvement account to pay for a benefit improvement, and then some additional issues related to purchase with the benefit improvement account when that account does not have enough money to fully pay for the benefit. As a reminder, previous benefit improvements have been paid for with contribution rate increases. And the BIA is a new method for funding a benefit improvement. The goal of the BIA was to pre-fund the improvement so that contribution rates did not need to increase to pay for the improvement. The BIA has, to this point, never actually been used to pay for a benefit improvement. So just wanted to go over the board's funding policy again. The funding policy is to set the rate at the greater of the two contribution rates, either the aggregate funding method or the minimum rate funding policy. The minimum rate funding policy is based on the normal cost of entry age normal cost method. It contains a floor and a ceiling based on the funding status of the plan. The floor is 100% minimum rate if the funded status is equal to or less than 105%, and the ceiling is 90% of the minimum rate if funded status exceeds 105%. And during the rest of this presentation, I will be referencing in particular that ceiling. The goals of the funding policy, the board's goals, were stable rates and a fully funded plan. So issue 1, the mechanics of using the benefit improvement account. So all benefit improvements increase the liabilities of the plan. Increasing the benefits also increases the plan minimum rate because it increases the expected long-term cost of the plan. And moving money from the benefit improvement account back into the trust fund does not adjust the plan's minimum rate, since the minimum rate doesn't take the plan assets into consideration. A change in the board's funding policy may be necessary to implement the intent of the BIA, which was to pre-fund a benefit improvement. So the second issue, purchasing a benefit improvement when the BIA does not have enough money to pay for that benefit. The benefit improvement that the legislature previously proposed and that OSA completed a fiscal note for last session had a cost of $899 million for the benefit proposed for active members and a cost of $87 million for the benefit proposed for retirees and survivors. At that time, there was $322 million in the BIA that could be transferred into Left 2 to help pay for the benefit. And that the difference between what was in the BIA and the cost of the benefit would have caused a 1.22% contribution rate impact to pay for the difference between those two. Since the fiscal note was completed, there's been some growth, some significant growth in the benefit improvement account. As of September, it was valued at $454 million. And so to get updated cost of a benefit improvement, the actuary's office would be able to do that for us, but we would need to provide them with a draft of a bill in time for them to prepare something for the December meeting. And then because the funded ratio is more than 105%, the current funding policy would be to drop down to the 90% of the minimum rate. I just want to remind the board that last year you chose not to follow this policy because of the uncertainty of the extent and duration of the impacts of COVID-19. The contribution rates under this benefit improvement will go down from the current level, not because of the cost of the benefit, but because of the funding status of the plan and the board's funding policy. And then I've got some more information about how that works on the next two slides to help visualize and see that. So here we have a chart of the contribution rate impact of the benefit improvement. In purple, this is the contribution rate if there is no benefit improvement. And in green, if there is a benefit improvement. The current rate is 8.53%, and then under the benefit improvement that was proposed, that rate would be froze through 2023-25, and no benefit improvement would result in the rate dropping down, which is the purple line, and it would still the rate would still slightly go down even with the benefit improvement, which you can barely see in that chart in the green line. And so here are the numbers behind that chart. So under the difference section, draw your eye down to that, the bottom section of this chart. This shows a difference between the previous chart, the green and the purple line, of 0.62% to the contribution rate with the benefit improvement to help pay for that benefit improvement.
I'm sorry, Jacob, could I ask a question? This is Mark Johnston.
Yes.
So I'm looking at the chart and it says this bill, that is the bill that was proposed at the last year's legislative session. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So the employer rates are shown in this chart from OSA. I did want to just draw attention to this because I received a question from someone who had gone over these materials prior to the meeting, asking whether there was also the rate impact to the employer, and there would be an employer impact too. OSA, this is I just screenshotted this chart from this table from the actuaries, and they just leave out the employer rate impact just to simplify it and squeeze everything into a chart that you can actually see. Just wanted to clarify that in case there were any questions about that. So to summarize my presentation, there are two bottom line issues for the board. Despite having funds in the BIA, a benefit improvement would cause contribution rates to increase because of the board's current funding policy, which doesn't take into account the assets of the plan. And then the board may need to take action to address the potential conflict between the intent of the BIA to pre-fund the benefit and the board's current funding policy. A possible solution to this issue would be for benefit improvement legislation to fix or freeze the contribution rates for a period of time. And while rates are frozen, the board would have more time to work with the actuary's office on long-term options to address the impact of a benefit improvement on contribution rates. So as I said at the beginning of my presentation, this was really intended to set the stage for Steve's presentation, where there will probably be more discussion between board members. If there's any questions, though, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Jacob, could you go back to that last slide? And then Wolf has a question. Thank you.
Yep. Yes, Wolf.
Yeah, Jacob, thank you. In a previous slide, you note that there would be an increase to rates. Is it really an increase to contribution rates, or is it an sustaining a contribution rate rather than lowering it?
Yes, it would
so
not be.
It would increase beyond what it would otherwise be, but its current rate would still drop.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Jacob.
And then, Jacob, that slide about the possible solution. So I wanted to provide a little bit of context. When I was asked to advise about potential legislation, that benefit improvement piece of the bill last year, this was the proposed solution. So rather than trying to, we've already been working with the actuaries to come up with some ideas for how you could accomplish the intent of the BIA to pre-fund a benefit without raising rates. Some of those are fairly complicated. They're all going to be new. They have pros and cons. There would be time to work on you to go over some of those, at least ideas with you, but it would be rushed during session. there was no opportunity to do that. Even to try to do it now in the remainder of the interim would be a bit challenging. And so the idea in the bill was just set the rates according to the board's current funding policy. Use that, set the rates for the next, 3, 4, 5 years, and then the board would have time. All the budget writers and the people who, employees, employers, the state, they would have some certainty over how this would all play out over the next 4 or 5 years. And during that time, you'd be working with OSA to figure out what method works best long-term to manage that stability. I'll be talking about rate stability in a bigger sense, but this benefit improvement is one of the pieces I'll be talking about in my presentation as well. So I wanted to highlight the fact that this particular proposed solution was the one that was thrown out there last session as a part of the discussions around the benefit improvement piece of the bill last session. And it's also a solution we'll be bringing back to you for your input in November as we put together a proposed benefit improvement bill for you. But there are other possibilities as well. They'll be a little bit more challenging, but I didn't want to exclude any mention of those.
Thanks, Steve. Can you also just maybe touch on the timelines? Because I think Jacob mentioned that they're going to obviously need some bill draft before they can actually. And so, we're in October, November, we'll have a presentation of some type of getting it closer to what we want to bill to look like. So I'm anticipating we probably wouldn't have a bill until December.
Yeah, what we would hope to get from you is in November, we'll identify some of the moving pieces, for lack of a better word, or decision points for the board. In particular, those decision points that affect the cost, and get some input from you so that we can then have a bill draft ready for OSA. And it probably won't be a full fiscal note, but at least they could have some pricing ready for you for the December meeting when you vote on the full proposal. So for instance, some issues like the ability to annuitize the lump sum payment, that won't have any effect on the cost at all. They're actuarially equivalent annuities. Other issues like the board at the last meeting, you asked us to bring back some options for the amount of the lump sum payment. And we'll bring back some options for you. Depending on which option you chose, that could have an impact on the cost. The decision on whether or not to fix rates for the next 4 or 5 years would definitely have an impact on what the OSA fiscal note would look like. So those are the things where we're hoping to get some guidance from you at the November meeting.
Thank you, Steve. Are there other questions? Not seeing anything in the chat again. Nope. All right, Steve, go ahead. Thank you, Jacob.
All right. All right, let's see if I can. So the next issue I want to talk to you about is managing contribution rate stability. Jacob mentioned the board has had 2 goals historically. You adopted these as part of your strategic plan right from the beginning. One was rate stability and the other one was full funding. And I want to talk with you about those goals. I want to start with giving you a little bit of a history lesson and some success stories to set the stage, because there's going to be some challenges. So when the board was first formed, one of the questions that was often asked, it was a question I got asked when I was staff to the old Joint Committee on Pension Policy, is why do contribution rates go up when the economy is going down and go down when the economy is going up? That creates a challenge for budget writers when you're asked to pay more at the very time that you are less capable of paying more. And that was a common question among policymakers. And then the board asked a follow-up question, which was, what can we do about that? And the board, you were the first one working with the actuary then to look into that particular dynamic in detail. And one of the things that the actuary came up with at that time, you asked the question, how much should we be paying? What's the right number, if you will? The board was created at a time where contribution rates for all the plans were at historic lows. I was in PERS Plan 2 at that time. The member contribution rate for PERS Plan 2 was virtually zero. You were giving me PERS 2 for free. The member rate for LEF 2 was at a historic low. And you had, the quite natural question for the board as trustees is this right? What should we be paying? And working with the actuary, the question came up, all things being equal, if you hit all of the assumptions, you won't, but assuming you did, if you hit all the assumptions dead on, what would the rate be? And it turns out that number is known. In actuarial terms, it's called the normal cost component of the entry-age normal cost plan. But in real life language, you guys chose instead to refer to it as the expected long-term cost of the plan. That's what you would normally be expecting to pay. And what you've learned back in 2004 is that you weren't paying anywhere close to that number. The rates that you were paying in LEF Plan 2 were not sustainable. Similarly, the 0% rate, unfortunately, that I was paying for PERS Plan 2 was also not sustainable. And so you began using that expected long-term cost of the plan as the basis for setting rates. Nowadays, that number is what you call the minimum rate. And the board adopted a policy back in 2004, or a rate schedule, where you gradually made annual step up in rates to get the rates that were being paid at that time up to that expected long-term cost of the plan. And in 2007, that was 8.64%. And again, to Jacob's earlier point, that's the member rate. The state and the employer would also be paying that 8.64 as well. It's a 50-50 cost sharing plan. So that was the number in 2007. The current 100% minimum rate, that current expected long-term cost of the plan, is 8.53. And from 2007 to today, that number has ranged from 8.41 to 8.83. So that's the rates that have been charged. The rates that have been adopted by the board have all been within that range, going back almost 15 years now. Remarkable stability. During that period of time, it's particularly remarkable because I want to point out a couple of challenges that you dealt with during that period of time. starting with the fact that literally within months after adopting the expected long-term cost of the plan as the rate, you hit the Great Recession. So you got your first challenge to rate stability right out of the chute. And then, but the board kept rates stable through that period of time. As Jacob mentioned, the assets in the plan don't affect that minimum rate. They don't affect the expected long-term cost of the plan in that sense. Immediately following the Great Recession, you had a different kind of challenge, a positive challenge. You had the historic market, in the longest sustained market upturn in history immediately after the Great Recession. So you had a negative challenge followed by a positive challenge. Also through this time, you had other changes in actuarial assumptions, whether they were related to increasing the how long you expect people to live. You know, the actuary calls those mortality assumptions, but we think of that as life expectancy. People are living longer, that's going to cost the plan more. You recognize those changes. They were as recommended by the actuary. Similarly, the actuary has recommended decreases in the earnings assumption from 8 down to 7.5, down to the 7.4 where it's at currently. And then most recently, as Jacob mentioned, you chose to keep rates level the last time you set rates right in the middle of what was then, the COVID recession, because there was uncertainty about the extent and the duration of that recession. So from 2007 to today, you have already faced some extraordinarily significant challenges, and you have kept rates remarkably stable during this period. That's the buildup. I don't want you guys to feel like the challenges that I'm just about to talk about are insurmountable, because you have already overcome some extraordinary challenges. And with respect to the funded ratio, let me just say what I have. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future, but also historically. I've said it before for board members who've been around since 2010, 11, 12. Left Plan 2 was the only public plan in the entire nation that came through the Great Recession fully funded, with no benefit decreases and no contribution rate increases. You were the only one. That is an extraordinary achievement. So by reminding you of how good you are, now let's talk about some of the challenges that you're about ready to face. Hopefully you feel like you're up to them. You've got kind of three different drivers, cost drivers, that you are facing right now. And the actuary talked about a couple of these last month. You've been talking about the benefit improvement all interim. And since the actuary's presentations last month about asset gains and economic assumptions, there have been a number of questions about, well, how do these relate to each other? Whether they're, in some cases, Steve, if we adopt the economic assumptions, does that mean we can't do the benefit improvement? How do they all fit together? And the answer was, at least a month ago, it's like, I don't know. So let's get some data from the actuary, some info from the actuary's office, and let's talk about that in October and get a better feel for all of these different drivers, and in particular, I'm hoping to give you a feel for the magnitude of each. so that you can kind of, how do they compare with each other? And then how do they all fit together as a whole? So again, I want to start by saying each of these factors are separate and independent. Don't start thinking of, well, my decision in November on whether to adopt the economic assumptions is going to be tied to how I feel about the future economy or and investment returns, or how I feel about the benefit improvement that I might be voting on in December. They're all separate and independent. I'll talk about them independently and give you the idea of when and how you'll be dealing with each of these issues. And then one other caveat that I want to say before I get into this is I'm going to be using some slides from the actuary. I'm going to be using some actuarial terms. I am not an actuary, and this is not an actuarial presentation. So I'm not here to try to tell you that 6 years from now, this is going to be the estimated contribution rate. That's not the point of this presentation. The point of this presentation, again, is to give you guys a feeling of the direction and magnitude of these three separate factors affecting future contributions that you're dealing with, and your options for how to manage those these three different challenges. Okay, so especially, I know we've got actuaries listening. I don't want them freaking out if I use an actuarial term imprecisely or anything like that. You're not making any decisions today. And again, this isn't an actuarial presentation. All of these issues will get sorted out with the actuary over time. So with that caveat, let's get into them. And the first one is the potential changes to economic assumptions. Matt talked about this last month. OSA is recommending changing their general salary growth assumption, which is a positive driver, and changing their investment rate of return, which is creates higher cost for the plan. The net of these two changes would be a cost to the plan. And if the estimated increase, if you will, the board's current minimum rate is 8.53. That was already projected to increase by OSA in their next Val report up to 8.57. But if you adopted these assumptions, you would see that 8.57 move up to 9.18. In other words, that's about 61 basis points, 0.61% in rate increase. Again, there would be a similar increase for the employer state side of it. 61 basis points to the members, 61 basis points to the state and then the employer divided between them. And in the presentation, there would be a net decrease in the funded ratio. So the projected funded ratio in the next Val report, the draft that's out there now, is 113, moving up from 111, which was the last number that you saw. And that would decrease to 107 with the adoption of these assumptions. The adoption of these assumptions is on the agenda for November. And if they're adopted by the board in November, then they would be used by the actuary's office for any reports, like Val reports and stuff that they do in the future. But there wouldn't be this immediate change in the rates. So the actuary's office would start using them for their calculation purposes, but you wouldn't see an immediate change in rates. The board's already adopted rates for the next for the remainder of this biennium and the next biennium. So you wouldn't see a change unless you adopted a change in the meantime. Again, since the number funded ratio remains above 107, or would be 107, that would mean you're projected to drop to the 90% minimum rate for the next biennium. And so you see that minimum rate would increase from the 90% floor would go up to 8.27. And I want to point out that 90% floor because that that becomes important in discussing some of these other, well, once we get to the combination of all three. Before I move on, are there any questions about the changes to the economic assumption piece of this? Generally, more conservative assumptions. Here's a rough estimate of the cost, for lack of a better word, the rate impact of those assumptions and the funded ratio impact of those assumptions. I will say this, I just came back from the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans. I was teaching the Trustee Masters Program. I was talking with public fund trustees from around the country, and I did a case study, and the case study I used was exactly this. You know, all public funds are experiencing a variation of this exact same issue. All the public funds around the country beat their earnings assumption last year. Most plans crushed their earnings assumption last year. I'll talk about that a little bit later in my presentation, but Washington crushed the earnings assumption. And yet, every public fund in the country is hearing from their actuaries and from their investment managers, just like we're not hearing this just from OSA, but from the SIB as well, that you need to lower your earnings assumption for the future. It's universal. And so the challenge that you guys are facing is shared by every public fund around the country right now. Most of them are not in the healthy funded status as you, so it's a bigger challenge for a lot of these funds, but it is a very common challenge. I will say that the recommendations by OSA and by the SIB are not, they're not unusual at all. Again, every fund around the country is hearing the same thing from their investment managers and their actuaries. 7.0, according to the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, NASRA, their current study about public funds around the country, a 7.0 investment return would put Left Plan 2 right in the middle of the pack. So that would be the average assumption currently being used by statewide public funds around the country. All right. If there are no if you have a question, shout out because I can't see everybody's hands. If not, let me move to the next slide. And again, quickly, by reminder, you see this one is 61 basis points and a 6 to 7% decrease in the funded ratio. Next up is the benefit improvement. Now, you just saw this exact same slide in Jacob's presentation. This came from the fiscal note on the benefit improvement that was proposed last session and which the board has been talking about. And I want to draw your down to the bottom. The rate impact from this and the funded status impact is demonstrated, and it's 62 basis points. Remarkably similar so to what we just saw from the impact of the change in actuarial assumptions. And similarly, a 5 to 6% decrease in the funded ratio. Jacob already highlighted, one of the challenges is we've got to come up with a way to implement the intent of the BIA. If we're going to use the benefit improvement account to help pay for a benefit improvement. But in terms of the magnitude, again, this benefit improvement will have a cost to the plan. And this isn't the estimate, at least of that benefit improvement. Whatever the proposal that comes from the board in December is going to be slightly different. But just to give you a rough idea, this is the impact of that cost driver. 61 basis points for actuarial changes, 62 basis points for benefit improvement, and another 5 or 6% decrease in the funded ratio. Now that 5 or 6% decrease in the funded ratio becomes important because you'll recall from the last slide, the funded ratio was going to be 107 after the change in the assumptions. So with another 5 or 6%, well, now you're under 105. You're down to 102, maybe 101, but that's you're definitely going to be under 105, which means the 90% floor would go away. You wouldn't be using rates at the 90% floor, and both the increase in the normal cost or the minimum rate from the benefit improvement, the increase in the minimum rate from the change in assumptions would both go into place. And so you'll see here that that cost, you know, that funded dynamic that Wolf and Jacob talked about, where there'd be a cost to the bill, but by moving from the 100% minimum to the 90% minimum, you'd actually see rates slightly decrease. That dynamic would go away under the new assumptions. But then there's the third driver, and that has to do with investment, asset gains. Are there any questions? I know we've talked about the benefit improvement with Jacob and stuff, but are there any questions about this piece before I move on? Okay, so the third driver then is investment returns. And this has two pieces. The slide that you're looking at now is kind of one of the board members. This is one of your favorite slides from the Val report presentation every year, where they go through and they identify all of the deferred gains and the deferred losses that you have from previous years. This slide is from the draft Val report, which you'll be getting later this year. And the key piece about it is the last time you saw this slide, I want to say it had about $650 million in deferred gains. Since that time, 1 year has dropped off and 1 year has been added on. So some of those gains have dropped off, and the COVID recession losses now are being added on. So what you see is you've got 317 million in net deferred gains, but the losses from 2020 add up to 265 million, which means you have roughly a total of 50, you'll have in that Val report, it'll represent having about 52 million in deferred gains remaining on the books. So in the past, we've been, you've had that idea of deferred gains as a cushion. We had this historic market run up, and you had gains being deferred literally every year practically, except for 2016. You see you had a little bit there of losses that year, but you've got now all of that's, it's a clean slate after the COVID recession. The deferred gains and the deferred losses pretty much are going to cancel each other out. You'll have this little bit of 50 million left over. But the COVID recession is not the end of it. That's the valuations are on a lag, but as you'll recall last month, Matt talked to you about the 2021 estimated gains. These are not going to show up in the Val report that you get this next year. They won't show up until the Val report that you get the following year. But Matt provided a bit of an estimate of what you can expect, and working with OSA since then as well. This is what an estimate of what happened in 2021. So the return was over 28%. And that's just on the dollar weighted return. The time weighted return may actually be even slightly higher, closer to 30%. But for estimate purposes, you got about over 3 billion. That's about 3.1 billion over what was expected. That is going to get smoothed out over the next 8 years. You'll see 400 million of that recognized in that first year, 2021. And then the remainder of that, the other 2.7 billion, will get spread out over 2022 to 2028 using the current 8-year smoothing policy. Matt mentioned in his presentation that the effect on the funded ratio, if you didn't adopt the new assumptions, you would see your funded ratio increase from 113, where it's going to be in this next Val report, up to 131%, assuming you meet all of the other assumptions. That's where you would be at the end of 2028 when all those gains are recognized. So you, again, kind of give you some idea of the scale. We've talked about it a couple times already. Asset gains are not used right now in your funded method. They don't affect that minimum rate. They don't affect contribution rates directly. They affect the funded status. And so what you would see from these gains is approximately an 18% increase in your funded ratio. So again, you had 11 to 13% decrease from the other two items combined, which would take you from 113 down to 101, 102, maybe 100. But then with this added in, you can see that the magnitude of the gains is larger, much larger than either of the other two challenges separately, and it's larger than actually both of them combined. So out of these three factors that you're going to be facing regarding contribution rate stability, the good news is that the positive factor, for lack of a better word, I don't want to shouldn't call them good or bad, but the positive factor is the biggest one. So you're going to have more good news to manage from a financial sense, from a cost impact sense, than you are going to have challenging news to manage. That's one of the key takeaways that I wanted to let you know. Now, again, all of these issues, they come about differently. They arise differently. They're managed differently. So, I mentioned at the beginning, the actuary, you'll be adopting, voting on whether to adopt the changes in assumptions in November. And then they won't affect rates immediately, but they'll start being used in actuarial reports right after that. If there's a benefit improvement, then the benefit improvement might include a freeze on rates for the next 4 years or so. And then after that, though, the costs would roll into rates in the future, and they would affect rates. The actuary will do a 25-year fiscal note, but they'll affect rates, the cost of the plan, if you will, forever. You know, that's an ongoing cost. These investment returns, you don't get to control those at all, other than how you recognize them. And under, you know, those gains are already on the books. That's already happened. And the only tool you have for managing that is how they're recognized. And currently they're recognized over 8 years. So that good news will be smoothed in to the actuarial valuations and stuff over the next 8 years. But again, no immediate impact on rates. So similarly to what we saw with the BIA, this good news won't drive down rates in itself. Although what it will do, let me move on to the next slide, is it will likely mean then that your funded ratio is going to remain above 105. I mentioned earlier that the funded ratio is going to potentially dip a little bit from each of the first 2 factors. This will increase it a bit. You're likely to stay above 105 even in the short term for the next 2 years, and certainly over the next 6 to 8 years you're going to be over 105. You'll see that between 2022 and 2028, in fact, the net result, if you did all 3, if all 3 of them came into play, is you would still see the plan's funded ratio increase from 113 to somewhere in the 118 to 120 range. You would see the minimum rate, the 100% minimum rate, the expected long-term cost of the plan will increase from where it's at today at 853 to 9.8. But because of the funded ratio, you'd be at the 90% minimum rate, which will increase from 771 to 883. So back to Wolf's kind of initial question or point earlier, the 90% rate of 883 is still higher than the 853 that you're currently charging. So even moving to the 90% rate, the 90% floor, if all 3 of these things go into place, you would see a slight increase in the total cost. The member rate would go from 853 to 883, roughly. Again, I'm not an actuary. This is not an actuarial presentation. I'm just kind of giving you a rough idea of the scale of the moving parts. And you'd see a similar increase on the employer side, split between the local government employers and the state. Now, that 883, if you went back to that first slide where I talked about you're still within the range that you've been. If that's where you end up, you'd still be within that range of costs that you've experienced since the board adopted your rate stability policy in 2007. And the total cost, at least in the short term, would not change. It would still be within that range, of that stable range. The one clear caveat, though, is you're paying at 90% of what you would expect to pay. So how sustainable is that? You see, at least using what we've got here, your funded ratio would still be well above 105. If you're at 118 to 120, even paying 90% of the expected long-term cost of the plan, if you hit all of your other assumptions, you would be at that 90% rate floor for the foreseeable future. That would go out. It will take a very long time for that 90% floor to offset that additional 13 to 15% funded funded status. Now, Matt mentioned, and like I said, the economists and the other actuaries around the country agree with him. You had a historic return last year. There's going to be some give back, but remember, you're already managing that give back if it happens through your more conservative actuarial assumptions. So this is, again, a high level presentation of all of the three moving pieces, a rough guess, and I'll call it that, of how they would all play out, all three of them together, the directions they move, the magnitudes that they move. You know for a fact none of these are going to be exact, but this is not a presentation about exactitude. It's about kind of more of a strategic direction presentation, if you will. Now, here's where you guys are at and what you're going to be facing specifically in your challenges on managing these. Next month in November, you'll be voting on the adoption of the recommended changes to the economic assumptions. And again, those recommendations are supported by the State Investment Board, and they're in line with what every other public fund around the country is doing. So there is nothing unusual or about those recommendations that you're getting from OSA, but you'll be voting on those in November. You're scheduled then to vote on the benefit improvement in December. We'll get some direction from you in November on some of the moving pieces, but in particular, that idea about just go ahead and set the rates in the bill so that if the bill passes, you've got time to work with OSA on some of these other policies, implementing the BIA, and whether or not the extraordinary returns from last year could also be managed, be used in some way to promote rate stability. And if we have that time, then you'll be working with OSA to come up with those policies. If you don't set the rates in the bill, then we're going to have to come up with some stuff quick to get that in the bill before December. We'll be working with OSA anyway, just in case the legislature or individual legislators propose amendments. You know, we want to be prepared for what those would look like. But these are the next steps. in November and December, you will be making some very important decisions on these particular issues. Now, I know that was a lot to throw at you, so I want to hear from you if you've got any questions in particular, or just want to discuss amongst yourselves. The key takeaways, a couple of key for me though, is these challenges are not unusual. You have faced you've had great investment return challenges that you've managed in the past. You've had lowering economic assumption changes that you've managed in the past. These challenges are not unusual, and you've been extraordinarily successful. And the net impact, if you will, of all three of these factors would be positive for the plan in terms of the funded ratio. And so it's just figuring out some tools maybe to convert that funded ratio positivity into rate stability. Need some time to work with OSA to develop those, but it's certainly not an impossible task at all. We'd probably be able to bring you back 3 or 4 different options with pros and cons over the next several years, and you'd have a chance to figure out which one works best. And again, in the big picture, your challenge will be overall managing good news rather than the reverse. Are there any specific questions about any of those? Or
Steve, can you touch on the assumed rates for the other plans? Because I know that they were higher than us. And
yeah,
they're actually looking at, I mean, they're obviously same presentation to come down to that 7.0 number.
Yeah. I can't make any specific predictions, but let me just talk about a few things that are a little bit different between the challenges facing the board and the challenges that the Pension Funding Council and the legislature will be facing with the other plans. One, your funded ratio. Left Plan 2 is coming into this new period. Again, the next VAL report will show you at 113% funded. Your last VAL report was 111. You're in a great spot. The other plans are, the other open plans, the Plan 2, 3 plans, are also in a healthy spot, but they're more in the 95% funded range as opposed to 111 to 113. So they're in a good spot, but not as good as you. And the legislature and the Pension Funding Council uses different funding methods for those plans. And so the impact of, for instance, asset gains and changes in assumptions occurs, it manifests itself differently in those plans. In the aggregate funded method, for instance, the cost of the actuarial assumptions is immediately amortized over the current period of biennium. So you can see if you've got positive actuarial assumption changes, like what happened in 2001 and 2002, that's how the rates dropped so dramatically, is there was legislation to come up with more optimistic earnings assumptions, and that meant a lot of savings, which could be recognized immediately. In this case, because the cost of the economic assumptions will be, the impact of that will be felt immediately, the impact of the gains does, asset gains do manifest themselves under the aggregate funding method. And so what you'll see in the other plans is that the extraordinary returns from last year will have a positive impact on rates but it's going to be smoothed out over 8 years. So you might see, if you were looking at a projected rate chart for the next 6 to 8 or 2 to 8 years, you might see a small spike in rates as the cost is recognized, and then a gradual decrease in rates as the investment gains are recognized. And the net at the end of the 8-year period would be lower rates probably than what are being paid now, and higher funded ratios than in the other plans. But it'll take them that 8 years to get there. Now, that's where things sit now. The Pension Funding Council hasn't voted on anything yet, Dennis, and so that's the big caveat. We don't know yet what they're going to do as far as adopting the economic assumptions, and whether or not there will be anything from them or from the legislature next session along the lines of using the extraordinary investment returns to sort of smooth out that experience in contribution rates over the next 8 years, so that they're more stable than they would be under the current funding policies for the other plans. I don't know, and I haven't heard anything that gives me any insight in terms of how they're planning on managing that.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator
Senator Holy, I think you had your hand up.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve, I've got an observation, a very small question as to assumptions, and a question that goes back over the last couple of presentations. It just kind of came to me finally. Observation is this is eerily reminiscent of conversation in 2007 that we had when things are going so strong here, and we had to deal with the same situation and the same benefit and potential consequences of having a funding status that was rather significant. The difference was, I think back then, is you could afford to be a little more cavalier because you had a demographic running in front of you that was in our system, although not along with all the rest, but about 1977, when you look there, the systems were not truly mature systems, and they didn't have an immediate liability in front of them where funding status was something that had to be met now. It's happening underneath our feet versus something 10 years in the future. So, attempting to pump the rate up at that time, the expected rate of return was something that obviously was founded upon a great market. And we got spanked a couple of times since then. So I think that we might be a little bit more prudent overall at that point. That's the observation. Small question as to assumptions are, we're only touching on a 2th rate of return of general salary growth. When we actually have an assumption presentation and talk about this, are we going to address all the assumptions out there? And is there anything else that's in play that would have a bearing on this? I mean, that is another question, because I'm looking at the rate of return going from 7.4 to 7.0. I get that. It's obviously it's a balance of contribution rates and rate of return that's going to determine your funding stream. And yet general salary growth dropping from 3.5 to 3.25 in front of us here is also an assumption that partially offsets that 7.4 to 7.0 drop there. And I'm not sure what the ratio would be, but obviously it's not terribly significant at this point because we're going to see some rate increases in front of us here with the BIA on that. Can you address that? And I'll give you my big question after.
Yes. One, your perception of those two assumption changes is accurate. The salary growth moves in a positive direction. The earnings assumption moves in a negative direction, and the impact of the earnings assumption is far greater. So the net of them will be an increase. There is a third assumption that OSA will be bringing to you dealing with membership growth assumption. They were also recommending, I think they were recommending a small change in that. I don't I don't recall off the top of my head. There was, but it does, there was another, but it doesn't impact rates. So since it's not going to be a challenge as far as rate stability, I left that piece out of this proposal. But you'll have that before you in November. And Matt's been very clear. He sees all of these assumptions as sort of a package. You don't get to cherry pick the assumptions that you like and ignore the assumptions. They'll talk about that, I'm sure, as well, that caveat again, but that package of assumptions will be before you in November and before the Pension Funding Council in November. And then the only two, though, that I talked about were the two that affected rates.
Understood. And here's kind of a big one. I don't know, like many things that I throw out there, usually I'll stump Lisa Wan or Matt or somebody with this, but Steve, this is yours today. At the last couple of presentations we've talked about here, we've had a we're talking about everything we're doing here in the last two presentations is circling or hovering around managing contribution rates as part or the total conversation here. When you addressed early on in the first presentation about the Bakken issues that may well be protected out there, it appears to me that everything that goes to the legislature needs to come before the board and have the board refer it directly out to maintain that consistency. As a reference point, if you have a member of the legislature that wants to bring a piece of legislation out there, even if it's friendly, if it's a benefit, if it's something we really like and does us a solid, nonetheless, we could be setting precedent by deferring to call out on that our basis of authority that we're attempting to preserve here in the face of obviously a decade or so or more's worth of review or perspective or potential attacks out there that we've parried fairly well. Is it your opinion that we should absolutely make sure that everything that happens does not come from an individual member, but does come from the board here as a matter of preserving a foundation and a continuity of the board's authority, so that we don't actually provide some sort of a, I don't know, maybe an exception out there we think that it'd be a benefit to us, because we can't just like the good stuff or the bad stuff. We literally have to be consistent in our perspective on that. Can you address that for me?
Yeah, and so I can tell you both what I say publicly and then what I say in private. So in most cases, when a bill comes up and the board hasn't come before the board, and I'm testifying in public on it, that's all I say. This issue has not come before the board, and so I can't give any opinion of the board on it. Okay, so that is what I say publicly. Privately, when I talk with legislators, and they come from, it might be informal or it might be more developed, things along the lines of, hey, Steve, here's this idea for a benefit improvement. What do you think? Then what I say universally in private is take it to the board for a lot of the exact same reasons that you mentioned, Senator Holy, and usually for a couple other reasons, in the sense that it hasn't been fully as thoroughly vetted as it would be using the board's process. You guys go through, there's always at least 3 presentations and usually more on any benefit improvement. You've got price tags from the actuary's office ahead of time. We've done legal analysis, but oftentimes bills are proposed and they haven't gone through that kind of a process. The legislative process is a substitute, if you will, for the board's process, and the legislative process can happen in an accelerated period of time. Sometimes the actuary might only have 3 days to prepare a fiscal note before there's a hearing. Usually the legislature does a pretty good job of not scheduling a bill for a hearing until OSA has had a chance to do a fiscal note, but not always. And the policy issues, you might get more of the opinions or the desires of different groups, like, hey, that's a great benefit improvement, we like it, or that benefit improvement is going to have a cost, we don't like it, as opposed to really some of the more detailed analysis like the board might do, like how is this going to impact other issues like retention, what does this look like not just over the next 4 years but over the next 25 years. What are there hidden costs in the bill, for instance? That's usually where that, the budget impact over the next 4 years can often hide a long-term cost of a benefit improvement. Those are the kind of things that the board, just in my personal opinion, the board process does a more thorough job than the legislative process. And I don't mean that as a criticism at all of the legislative process, but that's the basis of my recommendation. Anytime somebody asks me what I think, I tell them take it to the board, especially if there's any kind of substantial cost. If they ask me, frequently I'm asked for, what do you think the board would think about this? Those questions I don't answer. It'd be like, I can't speak for you guys. It would be inappropriate for me to speak for you guys. It's not in my job description. So again, if they want to know how you would feel about it, run it through the board process, and then all those questions will get answered. There's usually, sometimes there's a political urgency, for lack of a better word, on getting something done, but there's very seldom is that really an urgency in terms of the plan. You guys are looking at this from a long-term issue, and whereas for an individual member, for instance, who's thinking about retiring, a benefit improvement might have a great sense of urgency to them. But you guys look at it, you don't look at it from the perspective of an individual member. You're looking at it from the perspective of 18,000 individual members, plus 5,000 retirees, plus 600 contributing employers and the state. And that is a much more rigorous, thorough, and in my opinion, appropriate perspective for these things to be evaluated.
Perfect.
So that's what I tell them in public and in private.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Any other questions for Steve? Anything in the chat, Tim? Not seeing anything. All right, Steve, it looks like we have, I think it's the expectation report.
Oh, Representative Berquist.
Oh, there you are.
Question.
Sorry, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Dennis. I just curious, is there ever a point where there's disagreements between the left board and the pension board for the rest of the plans, and how do those get dealt with as legislation comes up, and maybe it's recommended by one or not recommended by one?
Are you talking about benefit improvement legislation? Right. Yeah, that has come up. We do a good job of coordinating with the Select Committee on Pension Policy, and they do, I will say again, and their staff does a great job of coordinating with us. We've worked with them in recent years about coming up with some rules of operation, if you will, to manage that cooperation, and it's been, in my opinion, very successful. Now, that being said, I tell the staff for the Select Committee the same thing I tell our people, which is we can't control the policymakers. So we can't control what you guys are going to do. We could do our best to make sure the SCPP knows what you're working on and you know what they're working on. Ultimately, when they make their decisions and how they make their decisions may differ. There has been occasionally there'll be something where you guys have gone in front. You'll pass a benefit improvement and they weren't ready for that for the rest of the plans. And left 2 has a benefit improvement that's slightly different for a year or two. And then it gets passed for the rest of the plans after there's been a little bit more study. We haven't had a benefit improvement yet where the board has said, like for instance, let's use interrupted military service as an example. We haven't had a situation yet where the board says, hey, we want to include, you know, as a hypothetical example, we want to include campaign and expeditionary service, but we want it to be retroactive, and the select committee would say, well, we want to include that too, but we're really only comfortable making it prospective. So where you both pass the exact same benefit improvement, but in a slightly different fashion. That has not manifested itself yet. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Ade?
Yeah, Ade's got his hand up. Yep.
Okay, thank you. I think, Steve, I think you answered my question, but just to clarify, have we had any situation where the legislator actually did not go along with the board recommendation? And under what condition did that happen?
Well, with respect to actuarial actions of the board, like rates, there's been pushback from, and it's been, you know, it's come from the House, come from the Senate, come from the governor, come from D's, come from ours. This is not a partisan or a cameral thing at all. There have been pushback in the past on board adopted rates. However, the legislature as a whole has never adopted rates different. So every time that has come up and it's been discussed or debated during session, the end result has always been that the legislature has funded the rates adopted by the board. So that's been the case now for 18 years that the board's been in existence. As far as benefit recommendations, there have been a number of bills recommended by the board that were not supported by the legislature. Sometimes those proposals would get reworked and resubmitted, and eventually maybe the same proposal or a slightly different version of the proposal would pass 2 or 3 sessions later. There have been other proposals where the legislative process revealed issues that ended up killing proposals altogether, and they were never resubmitted by the board. So those kind of, for instance, an example of that, Ade, would have been, there was some discussion a while back about moving Left Plan 2 retirees into the PEB, the state medical fund. Retired teachers can move into PEB. And so retiree medical was an issue for Left 2. Is there a way to use PEB as a source for medical insurance for Left 2 retirees? And then when looking at it, it's like, well, the state subsidizes the PEB fund, and here's the cost. of that, and here's what would be the cost of that subsidy. And here's what would be the, so there was not only a state cost, but then also by adding retired members to the pool, the PEB fund includes all active employees as well. Left two retirees are generally pretty healthy, but retirees are not in general as healthy as active employees in general. So there was a concern that the costs, the claims costs of the fund would go up, and those are spread out over all the participants. So in addition to the subsidy cost, there was this implicit subsidy that all the PEB members might end up paying in terms of increased rates. And there really wasn't a solution to that issue. And so that's an example of a proposal that never, hasn't been addressed by the board since then, because there wasn't a clear path forward or solution to that implicit subsidy issue. And the board recognized that having other plan participants pay a little bit extra for left two retirees, that was a policy concern, and it was a policy concern for enough legislators that there wouldn't be support for the proposal anyway. So that's an example of a bill that was recommended, didn't pass, and was never brought forward again.
Thank you.
But on the fiscal issues, the rate setting issues, despite the fact that, well, I'll tell you this, from 2004 to 2010, at least, there was a proposal every year from somebody to change the rates adopted by the board. It was an annual occurrence there for a while, but then once the impact of 2008 happened, then the legislature understood in a very real way the benefits of your rate stability proposals. Because again, rates were going up, the investment losses from the Great Recession were driving up rates in all the plans except left two. And that was when they were first able to, in a actual physical sense, because they could see it or not see it, as you will, in their budget, they were able to experience what you were accomplishing with your rate stability proposals. And so since that time, the only time there's really been challenges to your rates setting authority has been a part of like some kind of rate holiday as a part of some other bill.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Did I get everybody, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not seeing anybody else with their hand up, nor do I see anything in the chat. So.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
All right. What we'll do now is I'll turn it over to Tim, and he can do the final presentation. And I will point out that we are right on schedule. So if we don't finish up on schedule, because I got some negative feedback about that after the last meeting, I apologize for making you guys work overtime at the last meeting. But if it happens, if it happens today, just remember it's Tim's fault.
Thank you for that resounding introduction, Steve. This is agenda number 4 on board expectations. Again, I'm Tim Valencia, Deputy Director for the board. Always a pleasure to be in front of the trustees this morning. This is the annual report out on the board member expectations over the last couple of months. All the trustees received a expectation survey they had the opportunity to respond to, as well as having a one-on-one expectation interview with the director. So those events inform the results today. So just by quick history, that in 2012, the board adopted an expectation service model. And through that process, we determined that the trustees, that you are our primary customers. So as a team, our success is based on meeting or exceeding your expectations. But to do that, we have to understand, what those expectations are. So we needed a process to get feedback from the trustees to understand your expectations so that we can then help you meet your mission. That's what this entire process then is about. So we started out to understand your expectations and then to continue to make sure we know what those are and do everything we can to meet those needs. So as you may recall from the survey, there's 7 core expectations that we base this process on, as you see on the screen. Now, these 7 we recognize really are more perhaps categories or buckets of expectations. We know that because when we developed these expectations with the board, the first year in 2012, we went to the trustees. We said, what do you expect? And we collected literally hundreds of data points about expectations. We were able to summarize all of those various expectations into these 7 core expectations, which the board had confirmed, yeah, that kind of fits everything. So we know that for each individual, each statement may mean different things, which is part of the reason that we do the interviews and the surveys, to try and ensure that we're meeting the needs of each individual and then thereby meeting the needs of the board as a whole. So let's quickly move on to the report out for this year. I'm delighted to share that all of the scores this year were exceedingly high, and every score above 4.9 on a 5.0 scale, with 5.0 being the highest level of satisfaction. So this, for both the team and for everybody else to know what their peers are saying, this shows that we have been doing or suggests that we've been doing a good job of recognizing your needs and meeting your needs for each of these categories. Now, let's put this into a relative time perspective in terms of how this process has worked overall. This is the 10-year measure of when we started the process in 2012 and stretching on to the current measurement year. You'll note this is the highest individual collective year that we have experienced or in terms of the scoring. You'll note that when we started this process, the satisfaction level was good, but it was significantly lower than what we currently use. And so what this chart demonstrates is that from a team perspective, when we see a score that is low or has dropped, we have the opportunity to measure it through this process, identify where an expectation maybe isn't being met, and we have the opportunity to make improvements to ensure we're meeting expectations. And you'll see a couple of times we've had drops in 2015 and 2018, but we had the opportunity to make changes and corrections. So, that's based on feedback that we receive from the trustees, whether it's individual interactions through the survey process, almost any conversation, we're always listening for expectations from the entire board or individuals. So I'm going to drill down one more level, and I'll show you the 10 years based on each of the individual 7 expectations. And again, this is valuable information for us because now we can look at each individual question to determine whether or not there is, something that we need to be focusing on or exploring further. Because this is such a small sample with the board, the numbers are very sensitive. So if one person changes a score from a year from 5 to 4 or 4 to 3, a 1 point change can drop an entire category from 5 to 4.9. But knowing that, we have an opportunity to talk to an individual where their score may have changed, or if collectively, if the score has changed, it gives us a chance to explore. But as you can see, by and large, all of the numbers have been over time, if you look at it as a pattern, we've been able to successfully continue to improve and maintain the service levels for each of the 7 core expectations over time. You'll note we did ask an 8th question, which was not scored, and we've done this the last couple of years. And this year, we were asking about your perceptions of how COVID has changed the operations. And the interesting thing to note is that a majority of the trustees all tended to comment on the moving to the virtual environment for board meetings. And so this is an area where we're going, well, this may be a new area of expectation to explore. And certainly we would invite some direction or discussion on this point about what your expectations are going to be for the future. You know, there's the scale from completely in person, which is what we were, to now we're completely virtual or hybrid meetings in the future. So that's a demonstration of, you know, if we understand your expectation, we're going to be able to make sure we can deliver a solution that helps you conduct your business. So, and likewise, there's always open comments. We appreciate the most of the comments were very positive towards the team and the job we've done, and we are greatly appreciative of that. And we do appreciate the individual input that some trustees provided to give us the opportunity to meet, you know, some individual needs as well. Because whether it's a very, you know, small individual item to a larger global type you know, process-oriented expectation, we take that very seriously, and we work very hard on that. So that is the report out on the 2021 board member satisfaction. Again, this is an opportunity for this team to gain greater clarity on any expectations that you have, because that's our key to success. So, you know, the questions that we pose out there are, you know, have those broader categories changed at all? Are there any new expectations, such as the change in meeting process? What are the things that we can do to provide a better experience for you and help you serve the board members and annuitants and the stakeholders for the plan? With that, I will turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Tim. Are there questions for Tim? Go back to my little split screen. I see nothing popping in the chat. I don't see any hands up. Tim, I'll ask it, and I think I've asked this before, but is there an internal process that you also do for your own group? I mean, our team there in Olympia, do you have an, you know, kind of a discussion and expectation review how you think you're all doing as well?
Steve, do you want to address that?
Yeah, the closest that we have to that is with me. So similarly, as I meet with you to get your expectations for the team, I meet with team members to get their expectations for me. And then that scoring doesn't show up here, but it does get it where you see the scoring on that is in my evaluation process. We don't have any kind of full 360 team scoring where, for instance, the other team members are evaluating Tim on how they think he's doing, or evaluating Jacob on how they think he's doing. Most of those, or a lot of those responsibilities, they don't overlap. So whereas some of us, you know, we all rely on Jesse and Jessica, for instance. They administratively, they're running the office, and we all need things from them to accomplish our job. But we don't have a process other than their annual evaluations for that. So I'll take feedback from other team members when I'm meeting with Jesse and Jessica to share with them how other team members, you know, comments or impressions about how they're doing. But we don't have a formal tool, Mr. Chair, for any kind of scoring other than the team scoring me.
All right, thank you. Are there other questions? I'm not seeing Steve. Do you see any more?
No, that's all I see. And
yeah, I'm trying to get the gallery up again. I'm not seeing it. All right, Steve. So the last thing we had on the agenda, it looks like, was the calendar. And I know we usually throw this out to the group and they come back and we'll adopt it here in the near future. I think it is.
Yeah, so this is just sort of the initial share with you about the proposed calendar for the upcoming interim. And there you go. Thank you, Tim. This is sort of the draft. The possible meeting dates are in yellow. And you see we're using the fourth Wednesday as for all of them, except for October, where we're at the third Wednesday. And then we've got a couple of different options for you to consider in November and December because of trying to navigate around the holidays. We coordinate this. Jesse does a good job of coordinating the availability of the boardroom with the SIB and also scheduling around different either educational opportunities that we know trustees might be interested in or planning on taking advantage of, or organizational conferences like annual conferences for WACOPS and the State Council of Firefighters, where many of you might not be available because you have your responsibilities to those organizations. So Jesse does a great job of trying to schedule around all of that, but especially, as you know, during COVID, all of that's fluid. So we're putting this out there for you now to get your feedback on one, like, is there a date that, like, hypothetically June 22nd? I don't know when the State Council's annual conference is scheduled for 2022. It's historically sometime around the last week in June, but if this happens to be a year that you may be moving it up a week for one reason or another. I remember one year it got moved up a week because of hotel availability or something like that. This is the chance to kind of identify those unknown scheduling conflicts, and then we will bring the schedule back to you for possible adoption in November and December. So if it looks good to go, you can vote on it in November. If you've got some other conflicts and we need to do a little bit more work, we'll bring it back to you. We'll hear about that in November and bring it back to you in December for a vote.
I think I'm just kind of looking at some of the state council events. I think we look pretty good. I'll talk to you about one date that's potentially problematic, but I'll work with you. So,
okay.
Right. Thank you for putting that together. It's helpful.
Yeah, that's kudos to Jesse, because there's a lot to coordinate between the SIB, all the different organizations, and all the different training opportunities as well. There's a lot of moving pieces that go into this.
And you said, Steve, that I know we looked at our November and December. There's two dates in yellow. Those options are both available right now for the SIB.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that'll be our discussion point, you know. So I would encourage our board members to look at those dates and be ready to kind of either move one way or the other at November. So, all right. That's all I got, Steve. I don't see any hands up. I see
All
that
right.
our next meeting is scheduled for November 17th.
Yes.
I assume we're still virtual.
Still virtual. I did want to make a note. We've been in contact with the State Investment Board. They are planning on continuing virtual meetings through the remainder of the year.
Okay.
And so that will be a something that we can talk about with you as to, but at this point in time, absent any direction from the from you that this current process doesn't work, we're planning on doing the same thing then. We'll have virtual meetings in November and December. We'll do the regular, we always have the virtual meetings during session, and then we'll all find out together how the country gets through the next 6 months and what things look like as far as returning to in-person or hybrid meetings in next spring.
Sounds good. Unfortunately. All right. Anything else before we adjourn?
That's all we have for you.
Yeah, I don't see anything either on the agenda, and looking around the screen. All right. Without anything else, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. Motion's been made and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed? All right. All right, everybody. We'll see you in November. Thank you for your time. Thanks for everybody being here. Be safe and have a good day.